Welcome everyone. My name is Kate Colvin. I'm the spokesperson for the National Housing and Homelessness campaign, Everybody's Home. I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to this Housing and Women's Safety Summit. It's fantastic to see so many people joining us. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are having this conversation on the unceded lands of Aboriginal nations around Australia. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri country, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to any elders and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members joining us today. Please feel free to share which lands you're joining from in the chat and to introduce yourselves. I'd also like to acknowledge our special guest, the Honourable Linda Burney, Labor spokesperson for Families and Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, who's joining our panel, and our other speakers and panellists who I'll introduce as we go. As we begin today to talk about housing, homelessness and family violence, I want to draw our attention to the fact that the challenges that these issues present fall most heavily on First Nations women and children. They are both more likely to be homeless and more likely to experience violence. June Oscar, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, wrote about how these issues intersect in her Women's Voices report. She said, "Throughout the Wihi Yani Utangani consultations, I heard too often that women were sacrificing their financial, social and personal security to avoid themselves, their families and extended families from experiencing homelessness." What this highlights is that these issues of access to housing and family violence are connected. And in essence, this connection is what this discussion today is about. So I want to give you just a few facts and context to start us off. Firstly, rents in Australia are so high that it is almost impossible for women on low incomes to find a home to rent they can afford. The Anglicare Rental Affordability Snapshot for 2021 revealed that a single mum with 2 kids on parenting payment could only afford 1 in every 1,000 rentals. Meanwhile, federal government investment in social housing hasn't grown, and federal investment in remote Indigenous housing has been slashed. In 2013-14, the federal government spent $2 billion a year on social and Indigenous housing. Well, a decade later, they've budgeted to spend just $1.6 billion. And most of the loss in funding has been in Indigenous housing. The consequence is that the proportion of Australia's housing that's social Indigenous housing keeps falling from 7.1% in 1991 to only 4.2% now. So these figures are why the Everybody's Home campaign was started, so that we could unite across the housing and homelessness sectors and work together to change government policy. We're going to post links in the chat so you can connect with the campaign by signing the petition to Scott Morrison to invest in social housing. But today we're going to talk about how these issues with housing and homelessness intersect with gendered violence to make women unsafe. We're going to explore how this problem impacts some women more than others. But today isn't just talking about the problem, we're also here to issue a challenge to fix it. We have today launched the Statement on Housing for Women's Safety. It was signed by 242 organisations from the domestic and family violence, homelessness, housing, welfare sector, the union movement and business. And many of you who signed the statement will be here with us today. So thank you for joining us and thanks for that great support. We are calling on government to pay attention to the safety of women on low incomes and to take action to fix the problems that trap women in violence. During the conversation today, I'd ask you to be active on social media to share our discussion with a broader audience using the hashtag Housing for Safety. We'll post this hashtag and others in use during the Safety Summit in the chat, along with the handles for all the speakers today. Before I introduce our first speaker, we have a short introductory message to share with you from the Minister for Families and Social Services and Minister for Women's Safety, Senator the Honourable Anne Ruston. The Minister was unable to join us, but has sent this video to open the event.
Thank you for inviting me to join you for the Everybody's Home Housing and Women's Safety event. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people and the traditional owners of the many different lands we all meet on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm delighted to get the opportunity to recognise the valuable work you do for vulnerable Australians, specifically for women and children who are fleeing violence and have had their housing security interrupted. Having a home is fundamental to the health, security and wellbeing of all Australians, and that's why the Morrison government is absolutely committed to making sure that women have the confidence that if they have to leave a violent situation, they will have somewhere safe to go. A woman should never feel like she can't leave a violent situation, which is why the government has introduced the Escaping Violence Payment, providing women fleeing domestic violence $5,000 in immediate financial assistance. This was part of the Morrison government's record $1.1 billion investment in women's safety in the recent budget, and works alongside our successful Safe Places program, which provides emergency accommodation to around 6,340 women and children each year when they make that incredibly brave decision to leave a violent relationship. Recently, I was lucky enough to open the first completed project here in Canberra, and was particularly impressed to hear about the support services that Safe Places projects provide on top of a safe place to stay. The National Summit on Women's Safety is on today and tomorrow, and brings together all of the consultation activities we've done to develop the next national plan to end violence against women and their children. You can be sure housing security will be a key priority in the next plan, and I look forward to hearing from more experts, providers and services about how we can work together to ensure every Australian has a safe place to stay. Access to housing plays a much broader role in increasing women's economic security, and reducing barriers to home ownership is a key part of this. We know the biggest barrier to home ownership is often saving for a deposit. That's why in the budget the government introduced the Family Home Guarantee, which allows single parents to put down a house deposit with as little as 2%. Whether it's through superannuation, direct support services or emergency accommodation, I'd like to assure you that the government will continue our efforts to ensure that women and children experiencing family and domestic violence feel confident that they can have the tools and confidence to leave a violent relationship. But we can't do this alone. The state and territory governments play a big role in housing affordability and social housing, and Minister Sukkar and I will continue to work very closely with our counterparts to ensure that we address this issue from all angles. Again, I thank you for the work you do and your ongoing support for women and children experiencing family and domestic violence. Thanks for having me, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes of your really important discussions.
Thank you to Minister Ruston for that message. And I'm now delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Kyllie Cripps. Kyllie is a Palawa woman, Scientia Fellow and Senior Lecturer in the Faculty of Law and Justice at UNSW Sydney. Kyllie, over to you.
Thanks, Kate. I'll just share my screen, just a moment. There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Kate, for the invitation and opportunity to speak today. Can I start, as is customary in my culture as a Palawa woman, to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Bedegal people of the Aurora Nation. I also want to acknowledge that as we gather virtually today, that we are meeting from many traditional lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I pay my respects to our elders, both past and present. And I also acknowledge the many working tirelessly in our communities and with our communities at the present moment, caring for them and doing their best to keeping them safe. I also acknowledge the Honourable Linda Burney, as well as the many wonderful speakers that we are going to be hearing from today. I also wish to acknowledge my colleague, Daphne Habibus from the University of Tasmania, who introduced me to the area of housing a few years ago. I've worked in domestic and family violence for many years, but I hadn't worked in housing until I met with Daphne, and her insights and the work that we did together inform the talk that I'm going to give today. And certainly housing is fundamental to the way in which we need to talk about domestic and family violence. So let me begin. Domestic and family violence is the largest driver of homelessness for women and children in Australia. It is considered the main contributor to women's homelessness, and it has been this way for some time, albeit many in our Australian society would not know it. Certainly, June Oscar alerts us in her Women's Voices report that Aboriginal women have been talking about this since way back in 1986 in the Women's Business Report. Women in that report were drawing attention to the significant connections between domestic family violence and the chronic shortage in housing, the long waiting lists for social housing, and the discrimination many of our women experienced in accessing private rentals. That meant public housing was their only housing option. And I quote June here when she says that when housing is unavailable, unsuitable, and unaffordable, our women's vulnerability to violence and intervention from child welfare authorities is heightened. And certainly that has been our experience in our research as well. And so the point here is that we are here 35 years later from that that Women's Business Report, talking about the same thing. It's a reflection of successive governments failing to appreciate the fundamental issue of domestic and family violence and its connection to housing and homelessness. All right. I put up this slide, and this is a poster that features in my Ahuri research with Daphne, and the link to that report will be in the chat. It speaks to the moments when Aboriginal women are grappling with the decision whether to stay or to leave. It's complicated because it's when the women in the middle thinking about the interests of a range of stakeholders. What they want and need is often made clear. But what that means for other groups isn't so clear. So, for example, what the kids want isn't necessarily clear to what the perpetrator wants, or what the community wants, or necessarily what the refuge or the housing areas want. And so not everybody's talking to each other, yet these are all the voices that the women are hearing. And the victim in the middle feels as though no one is supporting her and that she's unlikely to make anybody happy with whatever choice she makes about whether she stays or leaves. She's in a no-win situation and there's a lot at stake. This is the context or backdrop, if you will, for Aboriginal women needing housing. The circumstances in which they need housing are similar. They've reached a crisis point, whether after a single incident or a number of escalating series of incidences, at which point they need to leave their home to find safer accommodation. The question is, where will that safer accommodation be? Our research found that women and children leaving have very limited housing pathways to choose from. There are acute shortages in crisis, transitional and long-term housing, particularly in regional and remote areas. And as much as the last national plan and the last action plan in particular did seek to strengthen safe and appropriate accommodation options and supports for women and their children escaping violence by increasing the stock of affordable, accessible and social housing, as well as supporting women and children to stay in their own homes through safe at home initiatives. It was also to improve, and they were also offered to improve availability of accommodation for perpetrators so that women could stay in their homes safely. The available evidence suggests that, there still remains significant demand, that it failed to keep up with demand, and certainly in areas right across the country tonight. Women may call or turn up to a safe house or refuge and be turned away because they are at capacity. There is a desperate need for government to work with the sector to quantify the need, to ensure women and children are not turned away. It takes immense courage for women in these circumstances to make the choice to leave, to turn up to a shelter. They want support, they want change. To turn them away puts them in a frighteningly precarious situation. having recently reviewed the deaths of several Indigenous women who've died as a result of domestic violence, I can't stress enough that turning someone away is a matter of life and death. This needs to be taken seriously. It's also not, you know, when we looked at the research and what Indigenous women do when they're turned away from a shelter or a refuge, they then rely on family and friends to put them up. And family and friends are often also in a precarious situation because they know that the trouble is going to land on their door. And can they manage that? And if they're also in, you know, in accommodation with housing, they're also aware that that they're likely to get complaints if trouble lands on their door. So people are juggling really difficult circumstances, and if the women can't find housing, then they're in that situation where they have to return to an unsafe home. In terms of if they manage to leave and they want to get housing of their own, the wait lists for housing are incredibly long. When we did this research, it may come as a surprise to those that aren't in this sector that the wait lists on priority waiting housing lists are 2 to 8 years long. And whilst refuges might be able to keep people in the refuge, if you're lucky to get into a refuge for 12 weeks, and might be able to transition people into transitional housing for a further year, the likelihood of getting longer term accommodation while you wait for public housing is very slim. Trying to get onto that priority housing list is also problematic because if you've got housing debt, and housing debt might come about because you've got arrears in rent or damage to the property that's come about because of family violence, then you're not going to get on that priority housing list. And the other important point here too is the issue about when women were finally offered housing, they often felt that they were set up to fail. Fail because they have limited income, and a large chunk of that income is going to housing. The housing offered, they felt compelled to accept, even if it wasn't in the best of condition or in the best area. They often worried too, if they were already involved in child protection, that the child protection wouldn't see that the housing was acceptable, and that would put them in a precarious situation about whether they'd get their kids back. They were also many instances where the property provided was difficult for them to maintain. Who was going to do the lawns if they didn't have a lawnmower? You know, could the women's budgets extend to hiring someone to do the lawns? Probably not. If they didn't do the lawns, then they would be in trouble with housing and their tenancy would be at risk. There was often a disconnected understanding with the kind of financial obligations that women were trying to manage, as many were often on Centrelink benefits or on very low single incomes in the aftermath of violence. Many wore what was often described as sexually transmitted debt, including credit cards that they didn't know about, and as well as the housing debt. And we're trying to survive on what was left to meet the needs of living week to week for themselves and their children. So that sense of imminent failure was often sitting on their shoulders. The issue of service integration is a really important one too, particularly in relationship to housing and child protection. While service integration more broadly has been seen as a positive direction for the domestic and family violence sector, enabling improved support for domestic and family violence victims, especially those at highest risk. For Indigenous victims of family violence, we've found that they've felt that the service integration has further disempowered them. And that they've had an experience of triple victimisation of domestic and family violence, homelessness, and then the loss of their children via child protection. Exposure of children to domestic family violence is recognised as a risk, and many professionals are now required to mandatorily report families in these circumstances. Equally, housing stress and homelessness is seen by child protection as a risk factor. So when these two are taken together, Aboriginal women are often at increased risk of their children going into out-of-home care. When this is coupled with a history of stolen generations, Aboriginal women are particularly stressed about the involvement of child protection in their lives. All right. Oh, actually, I think that just went too far. Let me go back previous. When we think about the policy disconnect, the important thing to note here is that most jurisdictions now have time limits on the length of time children can be in out-of-home care, with reunification to their parents being the goal. This is usually between 1 to 2 years. We have case law that establishes that judges expect parents to have met the majority of child protection's identified issues before the first year to even be considered for a further year. And there has to be assurances that the extension of time will mean the remaining goals can be met. So if the issue is housing, can housing assure the court a house will be provided within that second year? If they can't, these limits will seriously have serious ramifications as to whether parents will be reunified with their children. So this is a significant issue. The other issue here too is the conditions that child protection place on the kind of housing that's offered. And the way in which they're determining risk in relationship to that housing, and whether housing and child protection are talking to each other in the offering of those houses, and as well as the financial implications of these issues of the housing. So the unintended consequence of this policy disconnect is that children removed may not be reunified because of things that are very much outside of the Aboriginal women's control. And so when you read June Oscar's report, Marcia Langton's report around domestic and family violence, as well as my own report with Daphne, we talk about a second stolen generation, and it's very much connected to this policy disconnect around housing and child protection and family violence. And just to put this into a specific context and not in this abstract, I just want to share a short case study. So this is in respect to a young woman, a young mum we met while doing the Uri research. She said she was told that to get her children back, she had to prove that she was no longer using drugs or alcohol. She admitted that this was a feature of the violence in her relationship. If she didn't use with him, he got more violent. She had to prove she was no longer involved with her ex-partner. She had to have suitable housing for her and the children. She also had to prove she had a job. She told us that she'd achieved all of these requirements except finding a house. She'd been on a public housing wait list for 2 years after leaving her partner. She'd tried to obtain private rental accommodation only to be turned away at the real estate office when they realised she was Aboriginal. When we asked if she was sure that that was the reason, she said, "They told me it was taken already, but it is still up on the internet as available. What other reason could there be?" Her last interaction with child protection about getting her children back broke her heart. The child protection worker told her, "Your children are settled now. Perhaps you should move and start a new life somewhere else." She said, "They are my kids. I'm their mother. I want to be there for them. I just need a house." This story goes to the heart of why housing cannot be separated from a discussion of domestic and family violence or child protection for that matter. It's essential that this next national plan has housing actions to support victim survivors. If it doesn't, then it fundamentally misses an opportunity to make a positive impact in the lives of those experiencing violence. It misses a fundamental opportunity to prevent Aboriginal children from being separated from their mums. Mums who've done all they can to get their lives back together in the aftermath of violence. And I'll just finish off with just a couple of areas where the policy actions for the next action plan can take effect. There can be investment in housing stock to improve the bottlenecks in crisis, transitional, and long-term housing. The first points can be done in partnership with the domestic and family violence housing sector. They know how many are being turned away. They know what their supply chain looks like. Their involvement in the planning and execution is critical. It needs also to take into account the needs in the rural, remote and very remote areas. And I know I'm short of time, so I might just leave it there. And just to say that there are another couple of points there in terms of reviewing housing policy to enable upgrades as well for the informal helpers that exist in our communities who are routinely providing respite to our victims of violence, the aunties, the uncles and those others that are in our communities. When the refuges are full, they're the ones that are providing the support, and we know who they are in our communities, and they too should be offered the opportunity for home upgrades as well. And just to finish off, there are some additional resources there from my colleagues at Ohuri, UNSW and UTAS who have been working with me in this space. Their work and recommendations are also important considerations for this next plan, and I urge the government and the sector to engage with them. I started today's talk recognising the long-standing challenge of housing, homelessness and domestic and family violence for Indigenous women and children. My sincere hope is that through the Everybody's Home campaign, our voices are heard and prioritised in the next national plan. Let's not be looking back in 35 years' time saying we still haven't got this right. The urgency to do this is now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyllie. That's really a powerful presentation. I find the connections between what happens in the child protection system and the housing system particularly shocking, as I imagine others in the audience do. Now, if you've got questions for Kyllie, please post them in the Q&A and we'll get to as many as we can in the panel discussion. For now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Angela Jackson, who's the lead economist at Equity Economics, to talk to us about her report, which was released by Everybody's Home recently, Nowhere to Go, the benefits of providing long-term social housing to women that have experienced domestic and family violence. Angela, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kate. And thank you everyone for joining today, particularly those of you I know who have got a long day ahead at the Women's Safety Summit. But of course we had to have today because the summit wasn't dealing adequately and hasn't been dealing adequately with women's economic security. And at the heart of that, women's access to housing, women who are experiencing domestic violence, that they have somewhere to go. I'd also like to start my presentation today by acknowledging that I'm calling from, speaking to you today from the Wurundjeri people's lands, and to say with a heavy heart that this report, due to data limitations, couldn't go to the intersection that affects women from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds in terms of them having somewhere to go. And I think the presentation we just heard from Kyllie in terms of the research that she's done goes to exactly the issues that are at play here. That for people to leave a violent relationship and they need somewhere safe to go. And at the moment, we're not providing that. And it's as simple as a complete and utter failure of government support, that women are in a situation where they must remain in a violent situation because there is nowhere safe for them to live. And our report attempts as best as possible with current data limitations to quantify that and to look to what would the economic benefits be of providing that housing. The context for this, of course, is also that in the last 12 months, we've seen with COVID a huge increase in the need in this space. We know that during natural disasters, rates of domestic violence do go up. We know that COVID in particular put additional pressures on families and increased the rate of domestic violence across Australia. And we saw that both in terms of police reporting, but we've also seen it in terms of the number of women presenting to specialist homelessness services. So in the 12 months to March 2021, we saw a 5.9% increase. We know that right now, particularly across the areas that are in lockdown, this problem is ongoing, that there are women who are in violent homes and violent situations that cannot leave and that need somewhere to go, and that this is urgent. We know that 4% of those women who are seeking long-term housing, 4% receive it. That is a shocking statistic and an indictment on a system that is simply not providing adequate housing solutions. We know that 7.3% of women who've returned to a violent partner did it because they had nowhere else to go. And around a further 9% return because of financial reasons. So women are returning once they have left violent situations to a violent partner because they have nowhere else to live. Now, we estimate, based on current numbers, that there are around 7,690 women living with violent partners across Australia who are doing so because of a lack of affordable housing. Now, this is going to be an underestimate because it's not taking into account the number of women who are simply not leaving or even trying to leave because they know there is nowhere to go. On top of that, women who do leave and do stay face homelessness. We know it is one of the biggest areas of homelessness in Australia, and one of the biggest causes of homelessness amongst women is fleeing domestic violence. Often they have children. It means being in an incredibly precarious situation. And around 9,120 women in Australia and children are facing homelessness each year after leaving a violent partner. Now, why has this occurred? Everybody here today probably understands exactly why this has occurred, and it's due to a complete underinvestment in social and affordable housing in Australia over the last 2 to 3 decades. There has been a fall in the percentage of housing stock in Australia from what would have been now the OECD average of 7.1% down to 4.1%. It's led to a critical shortage for people, and this underinvestment is meaning simply that people are staying in situations that are dangerous. People are facing homelessness that would not otherwise be occurring, simply because we're not investing enough in this social infrastructure in this country. So what are the benefits of doing this? We can talk, obviously, in some ways you would say, well, clearly, do we need to even quantify this? If we are making a woman safe and children safe, surely that is simply an investment that needs to be made. But it's important to recognise also that there are significant economic benefits from investing in social and affordable housing. Now, we estimate for this report that there's an immediate need. Now, this is not the ongoing need. It's difficult to quantify the ongoing need due to the lack of data, but there's an immediate need for 16,810 new social housing units to provide women and children in this country who are trying to escape domestic violence somewhere to live. This would cost around $7.6 billion. But the great thing about investing in social housing is it's an immediate economic benefit. So to be a $15.3 billion increase in economic output, 47,000 jobs across the economy. Incredibly well timed now in terms of as we recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and addressing a key issue for women and children escaping violence in this country. But the benefits don't just stop there. We know that domestic violence itself costs around $22 billion across Australia every year, the ongoing impacts of domestic and family violence. And by providing these units, you can mitigate some of these costs. And so we have a return in terms of for people not returning to violent partners, and also an economic return from people not experiencing homelessness. Again, these are underestimates because they're not taking into account the long-term economic impacts on children in particular and their economic output. But it makes sense, and it makes an economic return sense if you think if each year we get this return from that initial investment. It is about investing in our people, and the future payoffs in terms of the economy are also there. So I guess what we are calling for today is that the government sees that this is a critical part of the next national plan, that providing women somewhere to go makes economic sense, but it also makes sense in terms of addressing domestic violence. Simply, it is not acceptable, in my opinion, to have the policies in place to say that you want to end domestic violence and not provide women, when they do that, safe and affordable housing to live in with their children. Now, I will leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks for that great research. It really was super and contributed to some really great media footprints. So thanks for that as well. Can everyone post their questions for Angela in the Q&A? I'd now like to introduce our fabulous panel to join our speakers. We'll post the link to the event page so you can read all the details about these amazing women. I'm just going to do some quick introductions. Firstly, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Linda Burney, Shadow Minister for Families and Community Services and Indigenous Affairs. Hi to Linda. Now to Cassandra Goldie, the CEO of national peak body, the Australian Council of Social Service, or ACOS.
Morning, Kate.
Hi, I'd like to welcome Tali Starr, a fantastic advocate and trainer who has a lived experience of domestic violence and homelessness.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, Tali. And Tanya Farha, the CEO of the merged peak body, Domestic Violence Victoria and Domestic Violence Resource Centre. Hi, Tanya.
Hey, everybody.
So how this is going to work is that I'll start us off with a couple of questions and then we'll take questions from the audience. So just keep posting your questions in the Q&A and then I'll ask as many as I can. And also please keep the conversation going in the chat and also on social media. And we'll post again the handles for all the panellists. So Linda, can I start with you? What's your response to the Minister's comments and what would you like to see the government include in the next national plan to achieve safety for women?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Kate. Luckily, I'm an early riser, so this is okay for me. Can I also thank Kyllie and Angela for your presentations? And like Kyllie, I'm coming to you from the lands of the Aboriginal people. And good morning to Cassandra and Tanya and Charlie as well. Look, and I know that we're very short of time, so I've got a million things I want to say, but let's cut to the chase. My response to the Minister, and I listened to her on Radio National this morning, is I want this national plan to be full of action. I am very familiar with the last 3 national plans, and I think the Minister is genuine when she says this is not going to be a talk fest. But Kate, just in response to your question, I want to see obviously what we're talking about this morning, and that's a focus on housing. It is so important, not just for this space, but for so many other spaces. I want to see in the national plan, and I haven't heard the Minister speak about this, and I'm worried that we haven't heard it, is the thing that Kyllie particularly spoke about this morning, and that is children. Often they're also the victims of family violence, but they are also so important to the discussion. And Tali, I'm glad you're here. I want the national plan to be informed, and the Minister has said this in the past, but we didn't hear much of it today. I want this to be informed by the voices of people that have a lived experience and people that work at the coalface on a daily basis. The Minister spoke about the escaping family violence payment, housing security, some of the things that the government's doing to make housing more affordable for people. But most of them are not a direct response to the issue of escaping violence. Like many people on the call this morning, Kate, and I'll finish on this point, I also have a lived experience. And I know how economic independence is absolutely fundamental to being able to leave a violent relationship, and to understand that was the key for me. I was economically independent. So many people are not. And in closing, I just think advocacy should be welcomed and supported through the national plan, and services need to be supported as well. And unfortunately, I don't see much of that. Pushing housing onto the states is not the answer. A joint responsibility between the states, territories, and the federal government is the answer. You would know that Labor's plan for housing is a 20 billion, is a very large commitment, with a specific reference to 4,000 housing units for women escaping violence. So I think I'll leave it at that, Kate. But I am terribly fearful that this national plan will not be a plan of action, and that's what we need.
Thanks so much, Linda. And I just think it goes to show how important it is to have so many women in Parliament bringing all of the valuable experience that you bring to that space. So thank you for sharing that. Kyllie, can I ask you next, what would you say to the government about how important access to housing is for women stuck in violent relationships?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, everyone. And I'm coming to you also from Aboriginal land, and I want to pay my respects to them. I have actually come up with a little bit of a catchphrase for what I'd like to say to the government, and it's build, buy, save. Now, we know the economic value of all of that, but let's look at how that actually affects women and victims leaving domestic violence. If we are building housing, we are building into people's lives. We are restoring what they can do. We're setting them up for success. If we buy housing, we are also buying time for people to be able to get into a place where they can actually feel settled and come up with a financial plan to move forward. If we save, we're saving when we are doing these things, because we've already heard from our speakers before that we're economically saving, but we're saving lives. If we have somewhere to go, then we have somewhere that we can actually feel safe. And the problem is, and we've already heard, that the housing that is provided is inadequate. It's not safe. I had to reject a number of properties, and it was traumatic to even reject them because you're not believed. You're thought that you're making up lies about the property that you're being offered. But if we actually work collaboratively with people and we give them safe, affordable housing, we're setting people up for success. And the thing that really disappointed me about what we were seeing in that piece from Anne Ruston was I just didn't feel like there was any commitment or any depth or a real connection with an understanding of the issues. And unfortunately, I have a bit of a BS factor that kicks in and my brain will switch off. And I really don't like it because I want to be able to listen, but I've heard so much of this so often. And I want to be respectful of her and not say that that's what she was intending to do. But I feel like we get this rhetoric that just goes round and round and round and does not ever address the issues. When I finally had someone say to me, you know, what do you actually need to feel safe? What do you actually need to rebuild? That was the moment everything turned around. And I think we need to keep that in focus. If we don't keep the safety of people in focus, if we don't understand that housing is vital to that, then we are missing the point altogether. We need to stop saying we believe in ending domestic and family violence. We need to stop saying we believe in safety for women from domestic and family violence and sexual assault, because we're not backing it up in actions. We've just seen a whole lot of things not get passed that would have kept women safe. And we continue to do this over and over and over again. We do not engage with lived expertise and experience. We decide that they're just the poor, pathetic woman that needs to be tapped on the shoulder and go, there, let's see what we can do to rescue you. No, engage with us. We know what we need. We will get to that point if we are worked with collaboratively. And if you speak with respect and dignity with people, they will give you respect and dignity back. And if you engage in a real and authentic way, you will get a really brilliant answer. I'm just sick of this. We've discussed this with people. I'm part of a group who wrote a letter to actually ask the government to work with lived expertise. And we got a, yeah, we've engaged. No, you hadn't. Please, government, if you really, really care about this issue, you need to build, you need to buy, you need to save. You need to value women and children and other victims, and you need to put action onto it. I'm sick of words that lead to nothing. It's time for change. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kyllie. It's great to have your advocacy in the space, and I saw that letter come through and it's been mentioned in the media, so it's sort of really making a difference. Cass, over to you. Can you tell us, is it really just about housing? What else needs to happen for women and children to be able to leave violent situations?
Thanks, Kate. Can I acknowledge I'm on Gadigal land and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders and leaders. Linda, extraordinary as always, and Tali and Angela and Tanya and Kyllie. More power to the voices of people who know what needs to be done. And that is what government needs to respond to. I really want to highlight that so much of what needs to be done here is not complicated. It is actually very, very straightforward. The Minister acknowledged this morning that economic security underpins women's safety, and housing is absolutely crucial to that. And the other part, surprise, surprise, is an adequate income that you can rely on. And Tali, we know that when the government did the right thing last year and finally doubled the rate of job seeker and delivered the coronavirus supplement and finally overnight lifted women and their children virtually out of poverty for the first time in decades, a collective sigh of relief came into the households of women and their children. We knew that before then and again now, 1 in 3 single mothers are living in poverty because of the inadequacy of job seeker, of parenting payment, of Commonwealth rent assistance, which has not been increased in over almost 30 decades in real terms. Commonwealth rent assistance is a joke in terms of what it does to increase affordability for housing. And then, of course, the inadequacy of those payments, family payments, but coupled with the shocking conditionality, the rules that now apply to you. If you're a young mum, Parent Next is a disgrace. The Human Rights Committee of Parliament highlighted it's a breach of human rights, the way in which we treat single mothers, the lack of control that is given in your experience of navigating your way through to safety. And so we've got another briefing today, Kate. We will put it out again. It's the key other part of the picture about economic security is the reliability of income. And I want to highlight to everybody today in this summit and the journalists that are covering this, that when they talk about the adequacy of government commitments, let us remember when they say, well, we've got to be able to fund this, the government has just delivered $30 billion per annum in tax cuts. Overwhelmingly, most of those tax cuts will go to people with jobs, and most of particularly the high income tax cuts, they'll go to men with secure jobs, not experiencing these kinds of issues. These are choices of Parliament. The government has the ability to deliver. And when we talk about responsibilities, the government likes to play this game, as you know, Kate, you've had it over and over again, right, about the role of the Commonwealth in housing. Let us be very clear. The federal government has the overarching responsibility to deliver housing as a human right to every person, every child, and to secure the safety. And there is no question that social security is the core responsibility of the federal government. And for years, they've been using social security effectively as the bucket to make savings, to deliver on other kinds of measures. It has to stop, and we must finally invest to lift social security payments above the poverty line. the kind of announcement that the Minister has made over that domestic violence payment, that is helpful, but it is a one-off payment. It will not, women are not silly. You know, you've got to look into the future and say, can I afford to live if I make myself safe? And I also want to highlight that the supply of social and affordable housing is so crucial, but we want to support women to have the decision to stay, to be the one to stay in the existing housing. And that is about adequate incomes. That choice ultimately is about, can I afford to stay and to have the perpetrator leave? So I really want to highlight that that economic security issues cannot be separated from the issues of safety. Yes, we are talking about billions of investment, but after almost 20 decades of savings that the governments have tried to secure, the time is to invest properly here to make sure that it actually stacks up. The dollars, I mean, you know, the government likes to talk about you know, the stimulus in the economy. Well, women are fantastic budgeters. They know what the dollars are that they need to make themselves safe. And they know that at the moment, if you look at it, you cannot make it work because of the shockingly low rates of Social Security. If that's where, as a person on a low income, that is what you're going to rely on every single day to make sure that your kids can get their food, that you can keep the lights on, that you can secure the basics, and that's what keeps you awake at night. And of course, in this environment, the way Social Security is being developed now, it often can feel like an environment where it's not safe to be there because you're at risk of getting cut off almost every day if you don't meet some kind of appointment. So those rules need to change as well. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Cass, and it's fantastic to have you there fighting for those income rights for people, and I encourage everyone to join the Raise the Right campaign because this is really a street battle to get adequate incomes for the lowest income Australians, and every voice helps with that. Now, Tanya, over to you. Your members include family violence refuge providers, and we've heard today about how the lack of housing makes it very difficult for women to leave. Can you tell us a bit about how the lack of housing affects the refuge system and capacity in services?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel with so many esteemed people here. I feel quite humbled and privileged. So, hi to all my fellow panellists. Also, just to acknowledge, I'm on Turrbal and Jagara lands up north, so to acknowledge elders past and present, and of course Linda on the panel and all our First Nation colleagues who are on the call. And I'd also like to just also acknowledge victim survivors. Tali's here today, but also all those on the calls, because it's for victim survivors we do all this work. So just to make that quick acknowledgement. Obviously we've heard so much this morning about the impact of the lack of social housing on women's ability to leave. Can I just talk about a couple of statistics? Angela pointed out some really good statistics in her presentation about the difference between March 2020 and March 2021. I just want to say though, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, now this is a Victorian context, everybody, so I'm sorry, but I'm sure it's not too different in other states and territories, but something like 45% of people accessing homelessness services in Victoria did so because of family violence in 2019-20. So this equates to about 53,000 people. The majority of these people, of course, are women and children, but this is a 73% increase since 2011-2012. So huge increase. So Angela, your increase in a year, but if you think about it over a longer time, significant increases. Also, most recently, a member service that I spoke to said that their internal data indicated that about 77% of women that had accessed their service had had at least one experience of homelessness. So that's just over three quarters. And this includes stays in crisis and accommodation or refuge. So this threat seems so much more real when you hear the numbers like that, I think, too. I think, obviously, the inability to afford housing and risk of homelessness doesn't change for many victim survivors once they are in refuge. In fact, what it does, it keeps them stuck in the system because then they can't get out of the crisis accommodation into into transitional housing or beyond. So of course, family violence refuge or other forms of crisis accommodation are designed to help people at a severe and immediate risk of family violence to get out of immediate danger. So the main goal of Refuge is to stabilise a victim survivor's safety and help them safety plan to mitigate any risk of future violence so they can rebuild their lives. But I think for many victim survivors, once the risk of that immediate risk, because of course we know risk changes over time and is dynamic, once that immediate risk of family violence has at least been stabilised and it might be safe for them to leave Refuge, they're still on low or no income and can't afford housing to leave. And Cass has highlighted that so well and in her comments, so I won't say anything more about that. Of course, women are on income support payments and they're all too low to afford housing in this market. Kate, you talked about the rents being so high at the moment, so how can they compete in those markets? And we've also heard about the shortage of the availability of housing anyway in the wait list. So there's very few options to exit. I think something like the proportion of victim survivors who present to our services, so we're talking about specialist family violence services here, refuge providers, with no income is also quite high. The Victorian Crime Stats Agency indicated that about nearly 30% of support periods provided by specialist family violence services in 1920 were provided to clients with no income. So that's huge. So that's no income, not even low income. So Kyllie obviously has just told us about the impact of the severe impact on First Nations. Obviously, another group this is having a detrimental impact on is women on temporary visas. So we're seeing more and more women on temporary visas or have insecure immigration status come into the family violence system who are at very severe risk of family violence. So the type of temporary visa a woman holds will determine whether she's able to access income support payments at all. And with some temporary visas resulting in women not being eligible for any payments. So they have no ability to pay for housing and therefore no ability to do anything. So there is some legal provision, I should say, for women in these positions to apply for a different visa on the grounds of experiencing family violence. And I think we've all heard about these issues most recently too. But the practice, it takes a very long time for this process to go through and it may not always be successful. So staff in family violence refuges spend a lot of time and resources advocating for these women to be able to access some form of income so they can actually move on from the refuge system. So these women are staying in family violence refuge for a long time, anywhere up to 6 months to a couple of years in some cases. And that's if they, obviously there's other forms of crisis accommodation too, not just refuge, because refuge get filled up as well. So we know that the average stay in a family violence refuge is supposed to be about 6 to 8 weeks. So it's extremely stressful for families to be stuck in limbo like this for so long. So women don't know when they'll be able to leave and where they'll end up. And it makes it difficult for them to make community connections, find work, enroll children in school. This is a particular issue too, because the children keep being moved around. And so it's very difficult. And I know that, Cass, you mentioned about economic security for women to be able to stay at home, but not just economic security, we've got to also be able to assure her safety to be able to stay at home with children. And we don't yet, I think, have the proper purview of perpetrators to be able to do that at the minute. So we've got to work on both fronts for that, I think. The backlog in family violence refuges means that we also now have victim survivors placed in motels. Safe Steps, which is our crisis accommodation here in Victoria, our crisis service in Victoria, has told me there may now be up to about 120 women and children in motels on any given night in Victoria. So, and whilst that eludes the immediate threat, they can end up staying there for weeks as well. And we know that motels aren't exactly the nicest places for families to stay sometimes too. So many families feel unsafe there. And we don't want women to exit out of refuge into homelessness. So that's likely would happen if the families can't find access to housing from there. So really the whole family violence accommodation sector is really being brought to a complete standstill here and breaking point because of the lack of affordable housing. And we're not able to afford a good outcome or achieve a good outcome for victim survivors. Now, we know in Victoria, we've had our Victorian government announce the big build for up to nearly 1,000 new dwellings, which will help survivors of family violence. But we know that's not going to come close to solving this issue. We really need Commonwealth and state governments to work together to make affordable and social housing a reality for these women and their children.
Thanks so much, Tanya. That point about the whole sort of housing system sort of brings us to our first question. And can I just, if you want to ask a question, can you put it in the Q&A and then I'll ask them rather than raising your hand. So my first question is from Lulu from, I think that might be Women's Legal Service Queensland. This is a housing economist question for you, Angela, which is about, the government always pivot when we're talking about housing affordability to focus on home ownership. And can you tell us whether or not you think this trickle-down approach of sort of always putting resources and investment into home ownership will work to encourage more affordable rentals? What policy measures do we need to do to make sure there's more affordable rentals?
So yeah, we get this argument a lot about negative gearing and capital gains tax on housing, that this is, these are policies that make rental more affordable. Very little evidence for that, if I'm honest. And I think what we've got in this country is housing policy that's geared towards wealth generation rather than housing policies that's geared towards ensuring we all have access to affordable, safe housing in the communities that we want to live in as well. So the ownership, I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of a rent to buy type schemes. Like I think, ultimately ownership is something that does provide people additional security, particularly in Australia. But I think we need to look at other policies, acknowledge the fact that, the type of country we have become, I think, is not the type of country we necessarily see ourselves as. So we need to have much more rental protections, longer term tenancies. We need to see renting in a different way and have those protections in place, a more European model, and move towards that more European model in terms of security. And that will provide people in the rental market with the security that's, analogous to owning your own home, that currently isn't the case. So I guess fundamentally, I don't want to say we've got it all wrong, but the entire focus of housing policy in this country is about wealth generation. And it isn't about providing affordable housing and secure housing. And I think we need to turn that on its head and look at it again from that perspective. And suddenly new policies and new approaches come out of that. And there's a whole suite of policies that need to underpin that. At the core of it, though, is this investment in social and affordable housing, because ultimately the private market is not providing the type of housing people need where they need it. And that is, at its core, the fundamental issue. And we are seeing women who can't stay in their own communities, kids can't stay in school if they want to access housing when they leave a partner, or they can't access housing at all. And that's simply not acceptable. And we know that undermines the ability of that woman to continue to participate in work. We know it undermines the ability of those children to rebound from a domestic violence situation. So I think at this point, let's get some more social and affordable housing on the board through Commonwealth and state partnership. But then we do need a new approach to housing in this country that doesn't see it as about wealth generation, that actually sees it about what it is about, which is providing every Australian access to secure and affordable housing.
Thanks, Angela. And the next question is about this issue that Ruston and her colleague, Minister Sukkar, keep raising, is that, housing is a state responsibility. Given that can I direct this question perhaps to Linda and then on to Cass? What would you say about what the federal government need to do in the social housing space relative to the states, and how can they have some oversight of what the states are doing to deliver that housing?
Thanks, Kate. Cassandra, do you want me to go first? Or
You go first, Linda, sure.
Well, I think the point that was just made about the focus being on wealth generation is absolutely correct. And the federal government, I mean, I was just stunned, Cassandra, you'd remember when it was, when they just made this decision without any discussion, without any consultation with the states, that they'd walk away from the remote housing altogether, and it was a state responsibility. But it's not just in housing we're seeing this. There is a push on from the federal government to wash its hands of a whole range of things and say that they're state responsibilities. And the idea of the federal government addressing social housing is a pipe dream. I mean, it is not their base. They know that. The Prime Minister, whether you like him or dislike him, is irrelevant. But the thing that is obvious is that he is a politician that will make decisions that will deliver him votes. And social housing is not one of them. I hate to be so political, but that's the reality. Can I just finish up by saying that what is absolutely obvious, and, you know, you guys had to fight to get housing even on the agenda for this national summit. If it hadn't been for advocacy, it would not be part of the agenda. And how nuts would that be?
Thanks, Linda. Over to you, Cass.
Well, it's just simply not correct for the Commonwealth to say that it doesn't have a core and constitutional obligation in relation to housing. And I won't go into that, but just it's clear there is a constitutional obligation on the Commonwealth to deliver on housing as a basic part of the sort of social protections of the community in a general sense. In terms of policy, we've had excellent examples in the past where the Commonwealth has delivered large-scale investment into social housing. As you know, under the Commonwealth response to the global financial crisis, social housing was a key part of the Labor government's package that provided a lot of stimulus into the community, and it was excellent policy as well. Tragically, this time round, in our view, the Commonwealth went for cash handouts to existing homeowners and home renovations, which was deeply inequitable and has, of course, created a real problem for us in terms of access to a construction workforce to be able to get on with building more social and affordable housing, even when the states are actually the ones leading in trying to get the investment going there. So I continue to see that this, of course, is, we understand in the end, this is about politics. This is why we're here. I'm telling you, the women of Australia, I've had enough. This is a moment for women who know the reality. If it's not them, it's somebody they know who cannot afford somewhere to live anymore. And those voices are growing. And I am absolutely convinced for all those who want to be elected, that if they don't deliver on the agenda about securing more affordable housing for people who can't afford to live somewhere, they will be increasingly marginalised, because around the corner we are going to see more and more people sleeping in parks, more and more people sleeping in ovals. We're going to have women and children in buses. We have them now, and the media is going to do its job to tell that story, and we will continue to do it. So a Commonwealth government Political stakes will go up, as it did last year when it doubled the rate of income support and gave people breathing space to be able to afford the basics, and have moved to at least at that time deliver housing and a roof over their head for people. And so the policies are very clear. Angela, I think, of course, yes, the tax agenda is really important. We will persist in highlighting that we need to get housing and longer-term rentals as a sustainable housing option for people. In the chat, you see people are highlighting where we have to fix the no-cause eviction laws, because one of the drivers of people trying to secure home ownership is because they know, that you face an eviction every day. If you are in rental at the moment, that's the way in most states. And that is something that could be fixed, where we get a much better eviction law in place, and that can be done as a deal with the Commonwealth over with states and territories as well. But I do think that it is a complete. We've seen this debate in the COVID response, haven't we, about what's the Commonwealth responsibility, what's the state and territory responsibility. I don't think the public's cares anymore. I think they want it done, and I think that a politician that wants to get elected will face the heat if we don't get that kind of action. That's why the Everybody's campaign has been so important in bringing to the surface the political imperative about housing affordability as something that's a shared community interest.
Thanks, Cass. And can I quickly ask you, Kyllie, as well, if the federal government's putting incentives for women to get into home ownership, and then there's talk about these payments which would assist women into private rental, and then versus the option of social housing. I mean, from your experience, how do those sort of options measure up?
I'd love to say that's a brilliant solution, but what I have to say is that it is a microscopic solution. And what we really need is a holistic approach, like we've been discussing. And if I had enough money to rent, I would have rented. But my landlords also kept putting my rent up. So we actually need to address the rental system. And there was nowhere for me to be able to go that was safe, that I could afford on a disability pension. So we need social housing. If we don't have social housing, we're going to lose more lives than we already have. And this is a really serious problem. And we only deal with crisis. Let's start preventing it, and let's build housing now.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of the panellists. We're going to have to draw the questions to a close. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. But even though we're drawing to a close, it's not time to stop our advocacy. What we've heard today is that access to housing is critical to the safety of women who don't have enough money to be able to leave and rent a new place. So working together, we can put pressure on the government to deliver the housing that's needed. We've already had some success getting housing included in the agenda. But this is a collaborative effort, and look, that's why Everybody's Home was created. So I invite you to join the campaign if you're not already a supporter. But for now, if you're heading to the National Safety Summit, then we'd ask you to raise your voice about the need for housing in that forum. If you're not, then raise your voice anyway outside the room. Be active on social media, sign the petition to Scott Morrison and share it with your friends, and raise the need for housing whenever you meet with an MP or talk to the media. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really great discussion. It's been wonderful to see all of the chat in the chat and the questions coming through, and to have such an active audience. Thanks for your support of the campaign. Thanks again to all of our wonderful speakers and panellists, and onwards and upwards. Together we will we'll fix this one in the end. Thank you, everybody.